You're listening to Environmentally Speaking, a weekly podcast diving into legal matters surrounding the environment, public utilities, energy, zoning, and permitting laws in Rhode Island and the surrounding areas, with your host, Marissa Desitel.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Well, afternoon that we're recording. My name is Clarice. I am recording sans Marissa today. These are one of those very rare and few moments when I get full control of the mic. I get to go rogue. And in the spirit of going rogue, I brought on a special guest. We have Leo Pollock joining us on this week's episode of Environmentally Speaking. Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for coming on for today's episode. So we are focusing on a listener question of food waste, which is a gigantic topic, as we were just pre-recording chatting about. So in the spirit of talking about food waste and everything that's involved, tell us how you connect to that.
Yes, well, Clarice, appreciate the opportunity to talk food waste. Something near and dear to my heart, and something that it's exciting to see. I think more people are aware of and excited to kind of learn more about. So again, Leo Pollock. So I kind of came into this actually from an interest in agriculture. So I was doing urban agriculture work, kind of and education. So kind of teaching people how to grow food in the city. I worked for a great organization in Providence called the Southside Community Land Trust for years. And part of it was sort of seeing this kind of two separate issues. One was in thinking about urban agriculture, there was a need for more healthy soil, both in restoring urban soils and dealing with contamination issues. And then it was also just a recognition that there was all this food waste that didn't seem like it was being addressed, and most of it was getting mixed with trash and ending up in the landfill. I didn't at that point kind of understand the environmental problems that can create, but seeing that as sort of an opportunity, about 10 years ago, started this business called the Compost Plant with a partner, Nat Harris, who had a background in sort of rethinking waste streams as well. He had started a business called Newport Biodiesel, thinking about used vegetable oil as a fuel that could be turned into biodiesel. So we kind of put our heads together and thought, wow, there's really kind of an opportunity here to address this food waste problem and really try to create, at that point, what we thought was compost potting soils that could serve, a growing urban, suburban gardening, farming market.
That already opens up 1,000 questions for me. I'm so excited already. So what would you define, let's start at the way basics, building block one. What do you define as food waste? Are we talking leftovers, stuff we just never got to in our produce bin?
Great question. So kind of starting with that term, and I think it's unfortunate. So I think the first thing to understand is really there's a lot of complexity in that. I think the first place to start is we need to rethink how we think about waste. So, food, number of different forms. Sometimes, if we go into kind of, the normal house, right? So there's both food waste in terms of when we're preparing food, we're peeling things. There are pits and fruit. There's kind of the inedible stuff that is, not wasteful, but obviously there's nutrients and there's vitamins and minerals in those things that, if they're going in the trash, are sort of tossed, buried in a landfill, never recovered. So there's kind of that piece. There's also then the, things we leave in the back of our fridge that start to mold or start to rot, that from a food safety standpoint, we're not going to eat, we're not going to give to anyone.
I might be guilty of that once or twice.
Absolutely. So that's another component. So kind of food that's spoiled, that again would normally in most, I would say, American households, you find that old leftover container, you dump it in the trash. It feels a little bit of guilt of like, oh, I forgot about this. So there's kind of that. And then, when you get into kind of the commercial, or, when we think about supermarkets, it's those same things, just at a much larger scale. So, the produce aisle in a supermarket, they're pulling anything out that has spots or that is starting to rot, in part because produce needs to look good, but also in part just if you have a whole bunch of apples together and you start leaving ones that are bruised, you're going to start to get more produce spoiling. So it's kind of they have to pick through. So those things in general are traditionally have been kind of mixed with our trash and end up in the landfill. And the challenge of that around food waste is, as food waste starts to break down, not only does it start to smell, but especially if it's in a place where it's buried like a landfill, it's actually producing methane gas, which is a greenhouse gas that's significantly more problematic than carbon dioxide. So we hear a lot about CO2, carbon dioxide, as a greenhouse gas that we want to address, and methane is another one that we need to think about, and that's really where it ties back to food waste.
I think I'm still stuck on the idea of that old expression, one bad apple spoils the bunch. One bad apple can really just ruin all of its neighbors.
It is true.
What?
I'm not a food scientist, but you get kind of, if you think about it, the same reason that we hopefully want to eat nutritious food is, it's giving us the energy, the vitamins and minerals kind of we need for every day. So the downside is there are a lot of bacteria that also are happy to feed on those same things. So if food isn't stored properly, or if food isn't kept at the right temperature, it can spoil. And you definitely have the problem of, once something is kind of on or in one thing and it starts to rot, that's just going to spread across.
Huh.
So
guys, that expression actually, it's got some solid roots, and I might be the last person to think of that. So we've got all of this food waste. We have this problem of, and now thinking on a larger scale, groups and sort of that display of produce going bad at a supermarket and things like that. Tell me how compost either helps with methane reduction, how it handles it. What's the benefit of it?
Yeah. So, and I think this is good. So I'm gonna talk in general, kind of from the thinking about it, like in the commercial industrial space. That's really where we work. So the residential side is similar, but has different challenges or different logistics. But kind of to get to your question, so we have this problem of these volumes are generated in all these places. So restaurants every day are prepping food. Restaurants every day are clearing plates that people didn't finish. Supermarkets are clearing their produce. If there's a larger facility that's preparing food for a supermarket, so tomato sauce or something, they're going to generate a lot of food waste in that preparation as well. So there are all these different kinds of facilities. So the challenge of how we address it is kind of, there's a couple different components. So the first is, how do we actually set up a system where it's separated from trash and picked up? So there's kind of the logistics around, how do you work with different size customers? A supermarket, very different than a small restaurant very different than a large meat processing facility. So there are those logistics. And then the big question is, where does it go? So if it's not going to the landfill, where can it go that it can be turned into something or used in a way that's better than a landfill, and ideally doesn't produce methane and contribute to global warming? So there's kind of two avenues that seem to be emerging and have historically been kind of the way to do that. So the first is, as you mentioned, composting. So composting, can happen at a household, can happen at a much larger scale on a farm or at a industrial scale facility. Pretty basic concept in terms of it's been around for a long time, but mostly as a farm-based practice. So the basic idea of compost is, a recipe similar to baking. Food waste is high in nitrogen, has a lot of water and liquid. So that then gets mixed with things that are high in carbon. So things like dry leaves or wood chips, or sort of brush from landscapers, things like that.
Mhm.
So carbon high materials that tend to be drier. And so that you're trying to get to that sweet spot of mixing nitrogen and carbon and mixing kind of wet and dry to get this kind of optimal carbon to nitrogen ratio and moisture. And then the beautiful thing is the bacteria that naturally live on food waste and that naturally live in leaves and straw and those kinds of things are basically then you've given them kind of the optimal parameters, and they're going to start to basically digest that down and break all that food waste that could smell bad, produce methane. It's going to basically stabilize it as a soil amendment. So as something that smells, has no odor in the end. It kind of smells like a forest floor, the kind of an earthy, mushroomy smell. And that then is a great addition to farms, gardens. It's going to lock nutrients up in a way that is going to make them available to plants over a long term. And that, again, kind of stabilizes that food waste, stops it from going anaerobic and producing methane, and it's going to then stabilize it in a form, of sort of a soil amendment. I'm going to use some terms in here that are a little nerdy, wonky in the industry, so I apologize for that. And
I think this might be the place to be a full nerd.
I'll embrace it.
So that first route of composting actually prevents there being a huge amount of methane left over. So in that case, we're not even dealing with that byproduct.
Yep.
We've kind of cut it off at the head. So
exactly.
Tell me
so you've
about the commercial route. Tell me a little bit more. We've left my backyard. We're now, I don't know, I'm like an uneaten French fry at a restaurant. Where do I go? What happens?
Yeah. So same process, and so compost is kind of one direction that can go. The other is, and this was something when we started the business I was less familiar with, but the term in the industry is called anaerobic digesters. A lot of times they're called AD facilities. And those are so it's sort of the opposite approach. They also incorporate food waste. The idea here is it's sort of the same process that would be naturally happening in a landfill, so producing methane gas, but in a controlled environment where that methane is captured fully, contained, and then that methane can then be used as either it can be burned for electricity, so it's sort of a renewable energy route, or it can be kind of compressed and cleaned into a gas that can run larger vehicles. So you see some municipal bus fleets or service fleets like Waste Management runs a lot of their trucks on natural gas. So as an alternative to diesel fuel, things like that. So, it's sort of either food waste turned into compost as a soil, or it's food waste turned into renewable energy, and it in some way is then integrated into the energy grid.
You said that so casually. That's such an exciting idea. You can take food waste and capture all of that methane and power a bus.
And I would say that's one of the areas that is still really from a infrastructure. So the actual facilities in the US, there aren't that many here. There's a lot more in Europe, but it's something that I think we'll see, and you may be hearing more and more about, is that I think will be part of when we talk about sort of what is renewable energy. A lot of people immediately think, oh, it's, in Rhode Island, we have offshore wind, we have a lot of solar. In other parts of northern New England, you have hydropower. So those are the kind of the ones that we tend to be familiar with. But anaerobic digesters are going to be part of that picture, and they're not something that we're finding a lot of people know anything about right now. But it's kind of an amazing concept. Is in either case, food is energy. So it's either ending up as a stored energy that's then available to plants in the form of compost, or it's literally producing energy in the form of gas. In one case, in a landfill, that gas is just going into the atmosphere and it's creating a lot of problems. If it's contained and it's intentional and the facility is operating well, that's producing a gas that can replace, fracking gas or replacing electricity that would come from coal or other sources. So it can, that's seen as a renewable energy that's replacing traditional fossil fuels in that case.
That is such a cool concept. Oh, I love this idea. And once you've sort of, it's gone through, I guess maybe digestion or whatever that breakdown is, what's left? You've pulled the methane out. Is it a pile of dust?
Great question. And this, I think, is where the initial excitement starts to get a little more complicated on both sides. So and I can talk personally. So when 10 years ago, when we started the Compost Plant, my thought was, if we could figure out a way to work with a lot of different commercial customers and get a lot of that food waste out of the landfill, it could be composted. We'd reduce that amount of methane. There'd then be more compost available for gardens and farms, and that would be a solution. One of the challenges of that is then, Rhode Island, very small state, very densely populated state, challenges around, well, where do you site compost facilities? They need a lot of acreage. They need a lot of equipment. You have a challenge of they can't be necessarily near watersheds because of potential runoff. So, there are a lot of kind of challenges in implementing that. I would say with anaerobic digesters, one of the challenges is, you're right, what happens after that methane gas is produced, the energy is captured. So you end up with a couple. You end up with sort of what they call in the industry kind of a slurry. So it's sort of it looks like,
oh, Leo, that's
maybe
a word.
wet soil, kind of a brown slurry. So that then either has to be used in some way or processed further into something that then is stable again. So some slurry from digesters is then composted. The problem then is you're starting with kind of a lower level of nutrition because a lot of the energy from it has gone into the gas production.
Mm-hmm.
Some places are experimenting with kind of drying that out and turning it into, like almost like a fertilizer pellet. So something that would then turn it into, again, having a use. But that is one of the challenges. There's no this is the tried and true answer. We've seen some digesters that are now siting on dairy farms. And one of the benefits of that is, so we're finding some anaerobic digesters are sited on dairy farms. One of the benefits of that is that slurry can then be applied to fields. If they're growing corn for cattle feed, it can be used as basically a directly land applied fertilizer that is going to then be available, as a fertilizer replacement for plants as well. So that's one where it seems like, based on where the facility is being located, it has a direct land use application there that has some benefit. And then the kind of dry material that they would screen out can be used for bedding for cows and things like that. So there are challenges of it. There's some solutions coming up, but I think this is the learning lesson I've had is, there's no perfect answer for this. It's, there are benefits on one side, there are challenges. Some of it's, I think, depends on kind of regionally what's available. So in places where there's a huge amount of land, composting may be a better solution. The challenge then is similar to the digester, is if you produce a lot of compost, where is that compost going? It's a heavy material. It's like moving soil. So it has to be transported to a place where it can be used. If you then transport it, you're creating more emissions in terms of moving stuff with large trucks. So it starts to get messy really fast.
And you had said this is one of the lessons. What was, would you be able to share sort of a surprising lesson that you've learned in the kind of birth and development of the compost plant?
Yeah, I mean, I think and I have a couple numbers that I just made a note of, but I think the real kind of big revelation to me in diving, I did not grow up in the waste industry. It's a newer area to me, and I find it fascinating because it's generally sort of the idea in American culture is it's invisible. That was always surprising to me, that we put out our trash, it's picked up at early morning or when people are at work, and then we come home and the bins are empty, or things get emptied and we never see where they go, and we never hear anything back. And so it's sort of like we produce waste and it disappears. And that I find really fascinating from just in some ways, the waste industry is so efficient and tuned into the logistics of it. On the other hand, I think we pay a price in terms of when we don't have awareness of what happens to things, we tend to lose what the impacts, or we tend to not have any feedback about how to change behaviors that might impact that. And I think the biggest challenge of that is, and the realization that the scale of what we're talking about is just stunning. So just looking at Rhode Island, Rhode Island to me is always interesting because it's, we are the smallest state, but I think it's a fascinating example because it gives kind of a scale that things can be a little easier to understand. And then think about, a state like New York or California as X numbers of Rhode Island, or, to kind of extrapolate from that to think about it like, whoa, that's different when you're in a state with 12 million people.
Mm-hmm.
But just to give an idea, I mean, we're talking about the central landfill in Rhode Island. Rhode Island Resource Recovery did a kind of waste analysis study, I think in 2018, and they saw that just the amount of food waste that was getting mixed in with trash, was about 100,000 tons, 1 ton being 2,000 pounds a year, just from the residential sector. So that's the municipalities that are picking up trash and bringing it to the one landfill, and this is in a state with 1 million people. We're talking about 100,000 tons times 2,000 pounds a year. Commercially, it's a little lower, but on a similar scale, and that just feels like.
Just to go back, you said over 100,000 tons.
They said about 90,000 tons were just compostable waste, so waste that could have been composted. So that's kind of people mixing food waste in their trash.
Holy cow.
Sometimes trash getting leaf and yard waste that isn't going to for composting, or for things like paper or other things. So things that like could be composted or could go to an anaerobic digester, but are going in the trash. Just that, about 100,000 tons that we would need to, and ideally should be, diverting out of trash and finding something else to do with. So that's a big problem
That's
to
a
handle.
huge problem. And just to give our listeners some perspective, I don't know why I decided to quickly Google this. That's almost 2 Titanics.
Yeah. So
Oh,
when you think
that's
about
in a
what a
year.
ton, I mean, when I think about, it's hard. A ton being 2,000 pounds. You're right. It's hard to think about like what is the
Yeah,
equivalent of
what's the
that.
scale of that? That's a huge problem. Wow.
So it's just sort of stunning to me that there's that just amount of food waste, and that really a mismatch. I think we know now the problem around methane. So we know that food waste in landfills produces methane. We know that methane is a much more problematic greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, but it really feels like the momentum around solving that problem, we haven't, not just Rhode Island, but nationally, we haven't really cracked. And I think it still feels like it's very much in its infancy in terms of figuring out how do we get all that food waste out of the stream going to the landfill, and how do we then also have the range of facilities to manage it in a way that is producing more compost, more renewable energy, and not landfilling. And that's what's both eye-popping and it feels exciting to be really coming in on the ground floor of something that we're trying to figure out and trying to develop solutions around, but really in a space that still feels like there's a lot of potential and innovation and just kind of logistical connections.
And do you think that lack of awareness and that sort of lack of conversation is tied to the fact that, like you said, our waste is almost handled in secret? It's that idea of we put it in a dark bag where we don't have to look at it. It's in a bin with a lid. It gets taken out and goes away. And it's just that idea of discreet and quick removal constantly. So do you think that's in a way hindering some of our possible progress?
I do. And I think it's, from kind of a cultural thinking about like, how do we think about waste as a culture? I think that's fascinating. And I would agree 100% that I think that is to some extent at the center of the problem, that we think of waste as something, we produce it, we put it out, and someone else deals with it and manages where it goes. And I think part of the challenge of that is, as I mentioned, when you get all these things mixed together, it basically means that they're impossible to then sort out later. So the kind of burden of responsibility really in some ways needs to shift. And I would say the thing that's probably going to drive that is money. It needs to shift from the responsibility for sorting and figuring out how to kind of find the best use for this is on the end at the waste disposal facility, or on the waste haulers that are picking it up, and it really needs to come back to the generator, the producer, or the consumer. And I think that's true. We've in some ways started to understand that a little more with recycling, but I think even recycling, we've sort of seen that this idea that we can create all this mixed recycling and that it will get recycled in the way that we think it will is really not true in the way that we think about it. And I think we've seen some examples, recently where you've seen some of the recycling markets for plastic in particular, it's still generally cheaper to produce plastic from fossil fuels in a new form rather than recycle it. We see this a lot with glass. Glass doesn't have a lot of value when it's mixed with all different colors. So, different color glass, when it's when it's recycled, ends up having to go to basically brown glass, because you have clear glass, green glass, brown glass. So I think there's sort of we're coming to a point where some of those, like, what is really valuable to recycle, or what is really has value that's higher than landfill trash, we really need to be a little clear on. And I think the burden of that needs to go back to whoever is generating. And at the household level, that's individuals. And on the commercial level, it's businesses, so that responsibility falls back at that level, not kind of at the end of the line.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of businesses, the Compost Plant has partnered with several different businesses, specifically restaurants and sort of folks who are in the commercial food space. Tell me a little bit about your work there.
Yeah, so it's been we do work with a couple other businesses that focus just on serving residential. So that I think of it in terms of scale. So most households, the businesses that service residential would generally be, for example, they'd be picking up a 5-gallon bucket from a house once a week or twice a week or once every couple weeks. So it's kind of if we think about it in terms of gallons, like a normal house, you'd maybe have a small bucket that would get picked up every week. When you start to shift into like a restaurant, we work with bins that are closer to 50 gallons. So, we're working with small restaurants that are maybe producing 50 or 100 gallons a week. Then you kind of get into the next level up, a supermarket or like a dining hall at a university. They're feeding sometimes thousands of meals every day. A supermarket has turning produce every day. They have prepared food. They're doing cut fruit for customers. So there's all these different things. So there we're picking up sometimes 300, 500 gallons a day. And then you get into kind of the next scale up would be, like a big food processing facility. So a place that's producing food for, regional supermarkets. And there sometimes we're picking up, literally tons a day. So 20 of those 50-gallon bins, so 1,000 gallons a day, 1,500. And that's the hard piece is how do we, one of the challenges that we started out with is how do we have a kind of collection system that works for a range of customers, from that small restaurant that's producing 50 gallons a day all the way up to that industrial facility that's producing 1,000 gallons a day. And that's really what we've worked on, and I think have come up with a modified type of waste truck that's catered to food waste. So food waste tends to be really wet. It tends to be pretty heavy.
There's that slurry language again.
We are in the slop business. That's what I think every day. But that's really that was our first focus, is how do we basically find a way that works for different customers, commercial and institutional or industrial, that we can pick up and that we can get that material out of going to the landfill. And then the next phase was, what do we do with it?
And then that's when it came into this digestive energy producing exciting idea. I love this.
And that was sort of the evolution. So we started as a business that was collecting food waste. We were leasing a farm in northern Rhode Island, and we were producing compost, and then we were selling compost and potting soils. And about 2 years ago, we really had to take a step back and say, we're spread way too thin. We're doing too many things. What are we really able to do well? And so we really said, we're a organic waste business. So we work with generators of food waste at all those scales, and we pick it up and transport it. And we work with compost facilities that are producing compost, and we work with anaerobic digesters that are producing renewable energy. And so we are kind of the conduit from where that food waste is generated to where it can be processed in some way that we see as better than it going to landfill.
That's just awesome stuff. Now, I know we're getting close to time, so I want to wrap up with 2 questions. Do
Right.
you have any tips or ways folks at home could be more helpful? Is it better recycling, starting our own compost? I will say my husband gave it a shot. We learned very quickly you have to stir it.
Yes.
Yeah, we didn't know that the first round. What can we do?
Clarice, great question. And I think it's always kind of, we want to take it back to like, if you're someone listening to this and you're feeling like, oh, this isn't sitting well, like, what can I do? So it's interesting. I worked years ago with EPA, and they had a really interesting program called Food Too Good to Waste. And it's interesting because we always want to think about immediately, how do we deal with the food waste when it's generated, right? So like, how do we compost at home? And one of the things that really worked on is actually one of the real impact points we could make is, how do we prevent food waste in the first place? And so a couple just really quick kind of things to keep in mind. So the first was, they had a couple kind of tools for people at home to think about. So the idea was, when you're throwing away food, literally you're just throwing away money. So you bought something at a grocery store, you bought something from a restaurant, you didn't finish it. It's just whatever you spent going right into the trash. And so I think with that frame, the suggestions were, so the first thing you can do is, anytime before you're going to go shopping, shop your fridge first. So really take kind of an assessment of like, what do I have? What do I need? So that you don't get into and I'm guilty of this as well, is you go to the grocery store and you end up buying something that you already have. And then what tends to happen is the new thing you bought gets used and the old thing you had starts rotting and then ends up getting thrown away. So that was sort of their first, is look in your fridge, take a kind of quick, and then make a shopping list and do it based on some idea of what meals you're gonna prepare or want to make specifically. And so that's gonna kind of prevent some stuff in the fridge from not getting used. They also say like, designate area, or what I found is kind of pull out, new stuff goes in back, older stuff goes in front. And then you're more likely to pull the stuff that's in front and not let it push farther back and disappear forever.
I like that.
So kind of tools like that. I think in terms of like, there's gonna be food waste, a couple options. I would say, if you're someone who's interested in kind of embarking on home composting, it's not a hard technical thing, but it does require like sort of consistent management. And so I would say, ask yourself, like, is that something I want to take on? If not, no judgment. Then I would look at, there are some residential companies now that are providing food waste service for households. And in my hope in the future is, we'll get to the point where that's more of an offering that cities and towns do, but I think we're still a ways off from that point. So, we work with a couple partners. One is called Bootstrap Compost. There's a great organization in Providence called Harvest Cycle. And there's also an organization that focuses right now more on Aquidneck Island called Black Earth Compost. And they all are geared towards, kind of home composting. They have a bucket service. You pay a monthly fee based on how frequently it's picked up. And so I think those are great options as well.
Very cool stuff. And one more small tip for folks who have forgotten tip 1 and went grocery shopping, and now you have doubles. Learn about quick pickling. That was something that I found myself forgetting and buying. It was too many jalapenos or cucumbers or, onions, things like that. A quick pickle in the mason jar takes maybe 10 minutes start to finish, and it is tasty. It is some tasty stuff. So on that note, are there any big takeaways? Anything that we should kind of leave here thinking other than our awesome tips on how to be better?
Not specifically. I mean, I guess
Love it.
my parting thing would be, you know, at the home level, you know, just generally being more kind of aware around, you know, what you buy, what food ends up in the trash, what it could have been used for. And I think like that's a great suggestion too, is sort of using, you know, in that EPA thing, one of the things we did was not even with people composting, just putting your food waste into one container helped people really start to understand like, wow, I'm consistently buying this thing and then throwing it away every week. And so like, I either need to use that or not buy it. So I think, again, it's sort of back to, you know, what we touched on earlier is the more aware you are of sort of what you're doing, then helps you or gives you kind of more information to be able to make different decisions or change behavior. And I think that kind of tracking or awareness is kind of a powerful first step in thinking about, well, what do I need to do differently?
Awesome. Well, Leo, thank you so much. This was an awesome conversation. I've learned so much, and I really love that awareness piece in sort of preventing it before it becomes waste. I think that's really some powerful stuff. So if you guys ever have any questions, maybe you want to do a follow-up about food waste, if there are any other topics that we brought up that you all want to hear about, reach out to us. We are at help@desautelesq.com. You can hit us up on the socials. You can comment on our YouTube channel, our Instagram. If you want to be formal, we do accept emails. But other than that, have an awesome week and weekend, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Environmentally Speaking. If you're in need of an environmental attorney, we are here to help. Call us at 401-477-0023 or visit our website at www.desautellaw.com. That's www.desautellaw.com.